This is the FCC Missoula podcast, part of the Studio Life Faith Formation programming at First Christian Church, Disciples of Christ in Missoula, Montana. This is your place to live, learn, love, and grow in your faith in Jesus Christ. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of the FCC Missoula podcast. This is Pastor Matt with you here as we go through another episode of Worship Prep, where we take a look at the scripture we're looking at on Sunday. This will be for Sunday, February 25th, 2024. It is our second Sunday of Lent as we are moving through the time up until Easter. So today our gospel story that we're looking at is Mark chapter 8 verses 31 through 38. You may recognize some of this scripture. I know, surprise, surprise, I say that a lot, and I sometimes make assumptions that people know all the scripture stuff that I do, but I know that's not the case with everyone. But just throwing out, you may recognize some of these things, some of these themes going through here. So as I said, we're in the Gospel of Mark. We're just going to dive right into kind of going through stuff, going through the worship prep. Actually, you know what? Hold on. I'm sorry. Let's pause there. Let's think about this. Worship prep is a time for us to just spend some time together talking about some of the background of the scripture for the day, for the upcoming Sunday. It's a way to either prepare you for worship in a mental sense. If you just need something to kind of get you centered and focused, you could listen to this on your way to church on the Saturday before. If you're going to have a little Bible study, you could even listen to this afterwards, after worship, if you really wanted to as well, kind of get some other background information. One thing is I don't usually go too in depth. I mean, there are so many resources out there. You could find a bunch of different things, and you can even find a lot of conflicting resources because, you know, we all take things in different tones and light in the light of different things. But this is just trying to give you a little bit of a nibble, trying to stimulate your mind and your thinking about scripture, especially about the one that we're about to dive into tomorrow. Recording this a little bit late, had some tech stuff going on. But yeah, so this is being recorded on Saturday, going to post it Saturday, hopefully give people a chance to look at it. So yeah, let's dive into scripture. Let's talk about the Gospel of Mark. You can listen to some of our previous episodes that include the Gospel of Mark to get some different background information. Today we're going to talk about the oral history or the orality of Mark. That always drives me insane. So the Gospels were all written quite a long time after the life and ministry of Jesus. And so they would have been carried on through an oral tradition. The preaching and teaching of Jesus was orally shared, much to how many of the stories and the teachings of the Old Testament were carried on. It was through oral tradition. And at the time in which this existed, like, the oral tradition really was accepted. Even after the gospel was written down, we estimate that it was about 30 years after the life of Jesus that the Gospel of Mark was put pen to paper, or, you know, quill to papyrus, or however you wanted to. It was scrolled out. But about 30 years, give or take some time. And so at that point, there still would have been some oral tradition going on. Oral teaching of Jesus' life and ministry, especially as we don't necessarily know concretely all the different sources that Mark used to create the Gospel of Mark, but knowing that there was a lot of oral tradition shared around. You can even tell as you kind of read through Mark that it does kind of have a nice oral flow to it if you were to be reading it. But this is the first gospel recorded down. It's an oral tradition. Even after it was written down, there still would have been some orality to it. And that was acceptable at the time. You know, today we would probably have arguments and people even listening to this and say, it's like, oh no, it was written down. It was all this. Like, no, there was still oral tradition. I mean, that is how the stories of our ancestors made it forward. This is how we've seen people's experience with the divine. Even though it has now been written down and translated and all this stuff in the copies of the Bible that we have, it is still an oral tradition. And that actually even carried through in the African American community within the U.S., especially during the times of slavery, when it was illegal for them to be able to learn how to read or be able to have access to the Bible. That's a whole dark history that we can go down. But if you look at some of the Black theologians and some of their, like, talking about some of the historical context. This brings up the Black theology, womanist theology, and it talks about how it's like, because of that, there was a lot of oral tradition and teaching that happened, and allows a lot more, honestly, probably a lot more creativity than white Anglo Christian study. Actually, I've really enjoyed some of the coursework where I've had to really I've gotten to really focus on some Black and womanist theology. So it's kind of interesting how that kind of came full circle around. So let's dive into the text, shall we? As I said, we're in Mark chapter 8, verses 31 through 38. And as if you've been with us before, generally what we do is we read two different versions of Scripture, different versions of the Bible, to give us some different perspective or different ways in which the words are expressed. We're going to have some fun today. If you watched our services last Sunday, I used the New Testament for Gen Z, the unofficial ChatGPT Translation for Gen Z. We're going to use that as one of our translations today on the podcast. But we're also going to be using my tried and true New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition. So let's listen in, shall we? Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples. He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any of you wish to come after me, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in his glory of his Father with the holy angels." So that was the New Revised Standard Version, Updated Edition. Let's look at the for Gen Z, unofficial ChatGPT version, shall we? Again, 31 through 38. And Jesus started teaching them, saying, "Listen up, y'all. The Son of Man's going to go through some serious stuff. He'll get rejected by the older peeps, the top priests, and the scholars. They're even going to kill him, but don't worry, because he'll rise again after 3 days." Jesus said all that stuff out in the open. And Peter, man, he got all worked up and started scolding Jesus like, "Nah, bro, that ain't cool." But then Jesus turned around, looked at his crew, and went all, "Yo, Pete, get behind me, Satan. You're not thinking godly. You're all about human things." So Jesus gathered the people and his followers and said, "Yo, if anyone wants to roll with me, they got to deny themselves, carry their own burdens, and follow my lead. Because here's the deal, fam. If you try to save your own life, you'll end up losing it. But if you're down to lose your life for my sake and the gospel's, you'll actually save it. Like, what good is it if you gain the whole world but lose your own soul? Think about it, man. Or what could you even trade for your soul? Nothing, bro. So here's the deal, yo. If anyone's embarrassed of me and my words in this messed up and sinful generation, I'll be ashamed of them, and when I come back, all glorious with my heavenly squad." I really like that translation. It's a lot of fun to use. But some words to sit and reflect on. Jesus poses some very good points that are for us to even reflect upon in our time today as Christians, because we are following Jesus. At least that's what we say, but that's what we should be doing. And so Jesus is laying some things out for us to pay attention to. So this this is actually quite a substantial move. We were in chapter 2, but the Revised Common Lectionary is sending us out to chapter 8. So we skipped a bunch of stuff. We're going to be kind of jumping around between some other parts of Mark and the Gospel of John for the rest of Lent. So just some things to keep in mind. So this comes from the section of Scripture that's kind of divided out of Mark. It's referred to as how the Son of Man is meant to suffer. And then today is text also on how, people who are going to follow in his way are also going to suffer. That's not necessarily a bad thing. And that's probably going to be more of what I'm going to dive into a little bit tomorrow. Just something to think about is like, is us having to suffer in the world, especially if through suffering through our faith, a bad thing? Or is it part of the process of how we can change the world? So the interesting thing that stands out as we first read through this is, Jesus saying he's going to die and it's going to be resurrected in 3 days. And it's like, we kind of understand that probably at this point in our society. I mean, even people who aren't Christians, who don't study scripture or whatnot, would be like, probably recognize, oh yeah, that whole like Jesus foretold that he was going to die, rise 3 days. It's relatively common knowledge at this point. But the thing that really stands out is that Peter rebukes Jesus in this point. Now, in the scripture leading up to our scripture today, Peter has just referred to Jesus as the Messiah. And it's like, and so now he's struggling to comprehend that the Messiah is going to suffer. What the heck is going on? Jesus, come on. So he's rebuking what Jesus said. I mean, can you imagine that? And rebuking is like a way that would have been to flesh out the demonic, cast out the evil spirit of a person, like almost kind of following the way that like the friends and family had done in the, going to the hometown and was rebuked by the hometown, saying like, oh, you're crazy. He's like basically calling Jesus crazy. And then Jesus like throws it right back and says, dude, you've just called me the Messiah. And like, you're not having this faith because I'm telling you that these things are going to happen. I mean, you can almost kind of understand Peter's point though, and because we have to remember, these are people, and they're having some human reaction things. Like this person that you've dedicated to follow and that you believe these teaching of has just said, "I'm going to die," and it's just like, what? Especially after you've seen like the miracles performed and the people gathering, and Peter's like, dude, no, that can't happen. It's like Jesus, like, yeah. It's going to happen. And each of you is going to need to follow me. It is not like, don't focus on the human things. He calls Peter out basically. He's like, you're focusing on human stuff, focusing on the worldly stuff and not on the heavenly stuff, the stuff that's good for the soul. So like, stop it. Right? Because we all need to get focused on the soul work. And then Jesus does something that's a little unusual for Jesus. Jesus is usually trying to get away from the crowds, but here he calls the crowd to him. And it should be noted that Jesus isn't forming the crowd. The crowd was already there. He's just like, no, come on. Like, I'll talk to you. I'll engage with you now. And he's letting them know that it's like, if you want to follow me, you need to take on my teachings. You're going to have to suffer with me. You have to pick up the cross and follow me. And now I'm sure that that there was probably some placement of things, especially when we say, oh, pick up the cross and follow me. It's like, was it necessarily going to say, oh, yes, like Jesus is going to die on the cross? There's other ways that, the Roman government could have taken Jesus out. It didn't necessarily have to be a cross. The cross was the most inhumane way to do it. But I almost imagine that the writer would have, put that in just knowing, Jesus would have been telling the story to make a point of like, you all are going to have to suffer. You're going to have to pick up your burdens and go along with it. It's kind of what the ChatGPT version translates it to: pick up your burdens and carry your burdens and suffer with your burdens and the burdens of the world as you follow me. Don't lay down your burdens or thrust your burdens onto others. And so the others have to suffer so that you can be comfortable in the world. I'm starting to dive a little bit into some of the stuff I want to talk about in worship. But Jesus asks a lot of very important questions. This is a very important scripture for us to reflect on in our journey of faith. And if I ever end up teaching like a class that leads up to baptism, this is going to be one of the scriptures we focus on. So that's really all I have for us to focus on today. I really encourage you to hang out with our sermon in worship. I'm getting a little self-centered, the sermon, oh yes, but join in the worship on the 25th, Facebook Live. We're live streaming at 10:45 a.m. It's going to be saved on Facebook. I'm going to try and get better about posting things to YouTube, so we'll also try and get recordings onto YouTube starting this next week. really trying to get some of the hiccups out of stuff, so that way we can move forward and continue to share the good news in Missoula. Because First Christian Church has been doing work here in Missoula in the name of Christ, the name of God, since 1885, before Montana became a state, before the University of Montana existed. So it's quite exciting to continue on that legacy and tradition, and hopefully will continue to make a difference and an impact in our community. So that's all we have for our episode of Worship Prep. I hope that you had a good session with us today. I hope that this is at least getting you thinking, get your brain percolating, your mind going on this scripture. We look forward to worshiping with you on Sunday. Have a blessed day. Take care. Thank you so much for tuning in to the FCC Missoula podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode. To learn more about First Christian Church Disciples of Christ in Missoula, Montana, visit www.fccmissoula.org. You can also follow us on social media, with Facebook being at FCC Missoula and all other social media platforms at FCC_Missoula. If you have questions or want to reach out about this podcast, you can email us at podcast@fccmissoula.org. Thank you and have a blessed week.